Hey guys, welcome to the final debate. The two houses, in case you didn't know, are Churchill on government and Barton, on opposition.
Sorry.
My girlfriend's in Barton. It's an honest mistake. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna read the motion and then we'll get started. The motion for the final debate round is this House believes that economic espionage as defined by the FBI is rightly prohibited.
When I heard this motion, I was really glad because it's something I know so much about, and I just feel like we can all really engage based upon our shared knowledge of international law, FBI policy, and all of these great things we're so passionate about. So, in our definition of what the FBI policy is that took about as long to read as our prep time, basically, the conclusion is that any time that another person or an agency in another country comes to our country and steals intellectual property or plans that relate to trade secrets of a company, that this is going to be economic espionage and it's going to be punishable by our FBI. How we think this would work is you would get some sort of extradition, you would bring them to the United States, try them, and punish them. We think this is a pretty straightforward reading of the prompt. But we don't want to make this an easy debate for us. We want to hit the heart of the debate and prove it at its very toughest aspect. So while we think we can probably all agree that if a Chinese person comes, steals the plan for the iPhone to bring it back to China, turn a quick buck making knockoffs, we can all agree that that would be bad. And we don't want to have that debate. The debate we want to have is when somebody comes to our country to steal an integral technology, something that they believe is going to help their people, maybe even save lives in their home country. We look at the example of like pharmaceutical drugs. Say a new drug for malaria was released that was very, very effective, but the company in the United States was not willing to give the plans away for free to the other country. So it's very costly to save lives, even though the product itself would be cheap to produce. We would say even in that case, it would be unjust and impractical for us to allow that sort of behavior to go on. So what are my points for you today? First, we believe that stealing intellectual property is theft, both in the moral sense and that it's harmful in a practical sense. So why is this immoral? Well, as Christians, we see that theft is prohibited in the Bible at the most basic level. We don't think this is really a winning argument in this debate because sometimes we would say that there's a greater good involved, but we don't think that's the case in this particular case. But the Bible says if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. And we think this points to a very important principle. That's not just that theft is wrong, but that it's wrong particularly because it consists in stealing the fruits of someone else's labor. It says that you should be sustaining yourself if you are capable of doing so. If somebody else has worked for something, you don't have a right to that thing simply because you need it. Rather, if you're capable of doing work for yourself, you ought to do so and support yourself with your own two hands. We see that even outside of the specifically theistic Christian tradition, Western culture in general has recognized that theft is wrong for other reasons. John Locke, in particular, looked at the same sort of principle when he said that when you work, you invest your life, you invest your person into objects, and that by joining your person with that object, you get ownership of that object. So stealing is wrong not just because they're taking something you own, taking monetary value, but in essence, they're stealing part of your life. So what is a good example of this? We looked at Thomas Edison. He's famously had more than 1,000 attempts to find the perfect filament for his light bulb. He spent years developing the light bulb. So what if, on the day that he found the perfect filament, somebody was there watching him, and they saw what the filament was, and they took it back to their factory and were able to mass produce light bulbs at a very low cost? Well, what would that mean for Thomas Edison? It would mean that the years and years that he'd spent developing this critical technology, the technology that literally enlightened the rest of the world, would be totally lost to him. He wouldn't receive any of the fruits of his labor. All of those years that he put into it would be essentially taken back from him. He would lose the benefit of his labor and would not get the benefit of the creative good that he added to society. We think this would be tragic. But what about pharmaceutical companies? I've talked about them in my introduction. We think this is really where the hardest case for our side is. That what if there was a drug that could save millions in a foreign country, and somebody stole it and took it? Would that be evil? Even if it was going to save millions of dollars, and the pharmaceutical company wasn't interested in that, we would say it still is. Firstly, because we do think that theft is just intrinsically morally wrong, but also because it's impractical. So this is the second point that I want to bring you under why stealing intellectual property is going to be bad. So what do you see would happen? Well, when a pharmaceutical company develops a drug, it takes hundreds of millions of dollars for them to get one drug to market. Why is that the case? Well, first of all, because they have to invest in many different drugs to see if they're going to work. Most drugs that a pharmaceutical company invests money in don't actually succeed. Much like Thomas Edison, it takes trying and trying and trying again before they find something that's actually useful and that they can bring to market and sell. So you see what happens is if they didn't have that time period under patent law where they can sell it as the sole seller of that drug in the market, they wouldn't receive back in profit enough money to recoup the losses that they incurred before they had found the drug that worked. Yes?
You're talking a lot about patent laws and other laws like that. Are you suggesting that these things are already protected under the laws that we have without this even in place?
Yeah, so patent law exists primarily domestically. So if somebody in the United States has stolen the plans to a particular drug and tried to sell it, that would be an infringement of patent law and would be punishable. However, this is internationally focused. So while we have reciprocity agreements with a lot of foreign countries that will respect their patents if they respect ours, this isn't the case in all circumstances. So what this would do is where the patent law doesn't cover, this would have a specific international crime that they would have transgressed and that they could be punished for. Okay, so going back to my example, well, if they can't recoup those losses, what is the company going to do? Much like what would have happened in Thomas Edison's example, they would lose the incentive to go on creating new drugs. And specifically in things like medicine, we see this is really important because diseases are continually changing. The needs that human beings have, even outside of the specific area of medicine, are continually changing. We always need continued innovation to meet the needs of humanity and to save lives. So what would this do? Well, in the short run, the malaria medication would be released. It would go to India or Africa or wherever it was needed, and it would probably save millions of lives. That would be a very good outcome. But what would it do in the long term? It would take away the incentive that people have to innovate, to create new things that people need. You're sacrificing the people of tomorrow for the people of today. At the point where intellectual property rights are not respected, you will lose any chance to get innovation in the future. We're sacrificing the people of the future on the altar of the people for today. So we think that it's regrettable if a company makes this decision, if they have a critical technology and they're not willing to release it. We may even say that it's immoral for them not to release it. If your company had developed a malaria drug and you knew it could save millions of lives, we would say you should probably release that. You should probably give it away and say we're going to help these people because it's good in its own sake. However, just because an outcome is good doesn't mean that we have a right to pursue it by bad means. Paul protests against those who critique Christians by saying that they're willing to do bad things that good may come. He says, we don't think that. We have never thought that, and we never will think that. That's called consequentialism, and that's not what Christians believe. We believe that you should do good for its own sake. The businessman who develops that medication should release it. He should give it to the people in India, and he should give it to the people in Africa. But at the point where he doesn't, it would be immoral for somebody to come in and steal it through force. In addition to being immoral, it would be impractical. And for these reasons, we're proud to support our motion. Thank you.
All right, is everyone ready? In the first speech of the opposition, we would like to clarify three main points about the resolution. The first one is we are debating specifically not economic espionage in general, we are just debating economic espionage as the FBI defines it specifically. Now this matters because we're going to make a very strong point about domestic versus foreign economic espionage. Now under the terms of the definition, it says whoever knowingly steals economic trade secrets. This is important because it does not, like the government side argued, talk specifically about international. We would argue that domestic stealing of trade secrets can actually take place domestically, and under the FBI definition, this is also included. Now, why does this matter? Well, we think foreign stealing of trade secrets should absolutely be prevented. However, we fear that under the FBI definition, when you apply this domestically, you get gross violation of individual rights, as well as a sense of inconsistency about domestic versus international application. Now, starting our second point we'd like to clarify is that this is economic in nature. In other words, we just want to make sure very clear for the round that this is not terrorist in the sense that it's actually going to be actively attempting to take lives, merely trying to get an economic advantage. The third point of clarification we really want to emphasize is that this law actually has nothing to do with property or the protection of preventing of theft. It has everything to do with a foreign bias and trying to get the edge over foreign competitors. And this is important because while property needs to be protected, the focus of it is actually just to get an edge over on the foreign competition, not an actual protection of property. And we'll be examining this further in the rest of the speech. Now, starting off with the first point we really want to emphasize is limits on government. And we really want to emphasize that even though you have a good end, the good end of protecting rights, when you apply it in the wrong way, you get an ends justify the means scenario where you actually get a violation of other rights and the small attempt to protect one right. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, I'm glad my opponents brought up John Locke because I'm actually going to be using him heavily in this point. Now, the principles of John Locke is that we have something called individual rights that each of us are entitled to, but there's also a principle of hierarchy of rights. In other words, your life is more important than your freedom, life is more important than your property. You know, your freedom or your right to privacy is more important to property. So there's a hierarchy of if you have to choose, you should always try to protect life or freedom over an immediate protection of property rights. I would argue this is very logical and basic. I would rather have someone burn my house down than kill me. So, this is where we get into this question of, well, how do you balance the securing of rights? And we would argue that because this definition by the FBI has to be applied domestically, when you do so, it actually leads to a widespread violation of individual rights. Now, courtesy of the NSA, we all know what happens when government actively tries to protect you from terrorists and instead starts violating your right to privacy and peeking through every bit of your life. And we would argue that would be the implication of attempting to find economic espionage domestically. Yes?
So the motion, or the definition of economic espionage specifically says stealing of trade secrets to knowingly benefit a foreign government, instrumentality, or agent. We think it's specifically related to foreign interests.
Incorrect in the sense that the benefits of it have to go directly or have to come from a foreign agent. What we're arguing is that for example, you could get a domestic nation or an individual who decides to steal trade secrets from this company and make a deal with a foreign nation or foreign firm. That would be domestic economic espionage, albeit with a private benefit by dealing directly with the foreign party. So the idea is that it's not a foreign agent who comes in and directly steals the secret in order to trade with his original country or a different country. It can also take place with a domestic agent who takes action. And that is where we have a key issue with this definition because it implies that we can violate the individual rights of our own citizens in an attempt to protect property or intellectual rights. Now, I really want to emphasize the fact that under the American due process system, we have one very specific situation where due process or a right to privacy can be violated, and that is exigent circumstances. Exigent circumstances are the idea if I am a police officer and I'm walking down a street and I see someone getting murdered inside our house, I don't have to go get a warrant. I can go in and stop the murder. And this is very specific because it is the only exception to due process or the right to privacy found in our government. That is the reasonable belief that someone's life is in danger. And since this is economic espionage, that exception does not apply in this situation. Now, I again want to emphasize economic espionage and the stealing of intellectual property is a problem, and we should ratify or change this law so it applies only to foreign agents. But when you attempt to apply this domestically, you start trying to protect property and intellectual property at the price of actually violating our individual rights and our rights to freedom and privacy, which I would argue is not justified under a hierarchy of rights. Yes?
The motion states that this model of banning economic espionage is rightly prohibited. It's saying it already exists in the status quo. How are these horrible things going to happen if they already exist now?
Well, I think, courtesy of the NSA, we see the horrible things are happening now. Now, whether or not you want to argue, well, is this directly tied to economic espionage, I really don't care to debate it, simply because it's a principle of the fact that matters. In other words, when you give them the power to say, this matters more than someone's right to privacy, they're going to take advantage of it and use it to violate your individual rights, and the NSA clearly shows that. When you tell government you have the right to violate someone's right to freedom, right to privacy, just so you can find out, possibly, if you can figure out who even stole the trade secrets, who they are, what they're doing, and whether or not they actually did steal and try and benefit a foreign government. There's no clear justification for that, and there's no clear way to know, and instead you're violating widespread rights as seen by the NSA merely for the attempt to protect property. Now, this means us to the huge second voting issue. We really want to argue this. That is inconsistency, and that is, again, returning to the fact that this definition talks about whoever, not international agents, not even domestic agents, whoever, which means that this definition really has nothing to do with protection of property. It all has to do with America wanting to prevent foreign nations from getting an edge over them. Now, whether or not this is a good or bad thing is really irrelevant to them, because what we're arguing is, well, our opponents are going on about the importance of property and the importance of preventing theft. This has nothing to do with that. That's not America's motivation for installing this. It's only because they want to prevent foreign competition. This matters because, A, we already have laws in place to deal with the property theft, which means that this law really has no purpose other than to try and make America stronger, which I would argue is not a good justification for violating individual rights just because America wants to get better on an economic system. The other point we want to make is that this, under the American Constitution, economic espionage is not prevented. Now, espionage, or actual betrayal of your nation at the cost of human lives, and in which you actively rebel against the government, is a problem, and that is prevented under the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution, however, says absolutely nothing about espionage on a private scale, which we would argue this is what this espionage actually takes place on. Espionage on an economic scale and espionage on a private scale with a private firm to try and help another nation. Whereas this has nothing to do with actively trying to attack your nation, actively trying to violate it, because that would be actual legitimate espionage and qualify you as a traitor to your nation, which again doesn't apply under this definition. Under this definition, we would argue this takes place on a private scale, merely to benefit another nation and perhaps benefit yourself, which we would argue is not prevented under the Constitution. So by allowing this law to remain in place, you are instead allowing government more power by which to protect itself, not even property, not even actual individual right, but to protect and further its own self on an economic scale. It can violate other people's individual rights for the sole purpose of its own benefit. And we would argue this is inconsistent. And secondly, it's unjustified under the U.S. Constitution and unjustified by any reasonable understanding of a legitimate government. By violating individual rights for one's own benefit and violating individual rights at the cost of even violating privacy simply in the name of property rights. So for these reasons, we would strongly urge you to vote for the opposition side and maintain the limits and the defense against the government. Thank you.
Hi. I'm not sure when it became an intrinsic human right to be able to steal. I really don't get that. I just don't understand it. I mean, it's like, I was listening to the opposition speech, and it was very persuasive, it was very eloquent, but I really didn't understand the major point that they're making, the idea that we're infringing on human rights. Chris and I don't have to defend the NSA to defend that if we know that you're proven guilty in a court of law, that you gave economic trade secrets to another country, that you should be punished for that. I don't see how we have to defend the NSA. So what I'm going to be doing in this speech is I'm going to be going over the facts, because I tend to agree with John Adams that facts are stubborn things. That no matter what our inclinations or the dictums of our passions, that they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. I'm going to be talking about the facts of the case, the facts the opposition ignored, and the facts of the reason why you should be voting for the government. So first off, with the arguments presented by the opposition. Now, the opposition talked about how this is a resolution that is domestic in nature, and I have several responses to this. The first of which is that in the motion itself, and I understand it was very confusing, it's like a Faulkner novel, right? I mean, look at this thing, it's like, so I get it, but it specifically says, knowingly benefit any foreign government, foreign instrumentality, or foreign agent. And it's talking about the idea of the targeted acquisition of trade secrets. And we think that's very important to note. But I have a cough, sorry. But despite that, though, even if you buy their argument that this thing that's clearly talking about benefiting international agents is actually only talking about people in the United States benefiting international agents, I still think we win. And here's the reason why. I don't think they actually explain to you the impact of why the fact that it's domestic agents doing it makes it any better. I don't think they really explain to you that why somebody's stealing a trade secret and giving it to another country makes it any more right. If you steal something but you don't have an exotic accent, that doesn't make it any different. We think that's very important to note. So, So they really didn't have much of an impact other than the fact that this is going to be an abridge on privacy and an abridge on human rights because people apparently have the right to give these trade secrets or these patents to some other country. I don't think they have that right, and here are the reasons why. I think a lot of Chris's analysis on theft really went unaddressed in the opposition speech. Chris talked about how theft is a moral harm in of itself, and the idea that it's morally wrong to take something that's not yours because it's a part of who you are. And why that's a problem is that when somebody, even in the United States, gives a trade secret to another country, we think that's wrong for actually some more additional reasons. For the reason being that they signed a contract in the first place not to give this information away. They gave their word. Above that, though, we think, and I will take your point, yeah.
Does it clarify anywhere in this definition that these people have signed a contract or a gag order or anything of that nature?
I don't think when you are involved in secret information in a company that you're allowed just to freely give it away, and that you have a contract that you can't just freely give trade secrets away. That's why it's called secret. Anyhow, but beyond that, though, I would say there's another thing that's very important to note. They explained that there's going to be a very horrible world if you vote for the government. They talked about the idea that's going to be abridging privacy. It's going to be like the NSA. Here's our response to that. Our response to that is the idea that this already exists in the status quo. In the wording of the motion, is this House believes that the FBI's current policy is rightfully prohibited. This already exists right now. None of these harms that they're talking about are going to be created on a government ballot. I think that's very important to know. The NSA might be doing a bunch of bad things, but they're not doing anything bad in the realms of economic espionage. So that really isn't a compelling argument. So let's go down to their next point they brought up. Their next point that they brought up is the idea that this is just a way for America to gain a competitive edge over other nations. I have several responses against this. The first response against this is that it's in America's nature to have laws to protect their own interests. That's what representatives are sworn into the office to do. The second thing I'd like to say, though, is that in addition to that, we don't believe it's necessarily merciful to allow this information to necessarily go to another country. We don't think it's merciful to steal. We think it's merciful to freely give this information if they so desire. That they don't have that it's wrong just to take it for yourself. But with that said, let's go over some of the arguments I think really weren't addressed and explain why these arguments are more than enough reason for why we should be winning this round. The first of which is the reason. It's debate. You have to say that. The first reason is how stealing is morally wrong in of itself. Chris had a lot of analysis on why if you have a foreign agent take information from another country, take something that they didn't create and give it to somebody else, that is morally wrong. They never addressed that point. They said that we need to talk about domestic agents, but they never refuted the fact that it's still wrong to give something away that you didn't create. They never really addressed that point, and that point still stands. The second which is very important, is the practical point, where Chris talked about that if you don't have these laws, that if you don't allow if you don't have laws prohibiting people from freely giving this information away, what is this going to do? In the immediacy, you might have people benefit from these information. They might benefit from the information that's being given away. They might prosper. They might have a successful business. But here's what it's going to do after that. What's going to do after that is there's no longer going to be an incentive to invent anything else in the future. Why is that the case? Because if you spend millions of dollars, if you spend your blood, toils, tears, and sweat, and that thing can be freely given away, and you're not punished for it, we think you're not going to have incentive to create anything new because you worked so hard to create something. At the moment that you created it, it's no longer even subject to being protected. And we think that's wrong. We think the fundamental principle of property rights is that if you create something, you have the right to have that thing protected. And the opposition takes that away. They take that away so you no longer have a desire or have an inclination to want to create these things in the future. And we think that is a very detrimental impact. Even if they talk about having some wonderful goal of protecting rights, I don't think the opposition's way is the way to do it. If you vote government, the motion we're talking about isn't talking about taking away due process or actually having a warrant for the person's arrest. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. All it's saying is that if you give away a trade secret, you should be punished by law because you're taking something that's not yours. That's all what this motion is saying. I think Chris and I went head on embracing the hardest arguments of pharmaceutical companies, and even on that, they decided to talk about domestic versus international rather than actually embracing the moment. Even if they have a good motive To quote Dr. King, our ends must be as righteous as our means. And I think even if you have a good end to give a competitive edge to other nations, to help other people, you don't help other people by allowing them to steal from you. That's not how you do it. That's not how you do it. So here's what I want you to remember, because the opposition is going to come up and they're going to have a lot of persuasive arguments, but here's what I want you to remember. Even if they win on the point of domestic versus international, it's still just as wrong from a moral perspective to steal. Even if you think it's morally right for people to have access to this information, you're killing the incentive in the future. Even if they prove to you that this is going to be some massive impact, that the NSA will be our agency of enforcement, that still doesn't mean that we're taking away warrants, trial by jury, or any the idea of having reasonable doubt and reasonable information before you try someone for stealing in the first place. We think the government has given you more than enough reasons to support us. We think that's a fact, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is certainly a stubborn thing. Thank you.
You guys ready? First off, I'd like to just thank everybody for being here. I know a lot of you were forced to be here, but we appreciate it nonetheless. And I'd also like to thank our opponents, Churchill. We love Churchill. I personally love Churchill. And I'm so glad that we get to debate this final round against them, even though I still hope that we win. All right. I'm going to start off by talking about this principle of the ends justifying the means, which I think is really important in today's debate round. Do the ends justify the means? We, on-site opposition, do not think they do, but the government seems to be suggesting that maybe in this certain situation they might, and we would disagree with that. We'd also like to emphasize the fact that, while this may be a solution, it's the wrong solution, it's incorrectly defined, and it shouldn't be accepted as it currently is being proposed by side government. I'd like to go ahead and address some of the arguments that Jonah brought up in his speech against my partner's 2 points, talking about defining the resolution under the resolution definition. She talked about economic espionage as defined by the FBI also includes domestic agents, and I really want to emphasize that in today's debate round. It's not just foreign agents, as Chris tried to come up and suggest at the beginning of his speech. It's also including United States citizens whose property should be protected within their country. It's not just foreign agents who are here as immigrants or here under a visa. It's including United States citizens, so we have to consider the fact that their rights will be violated by this resolution. Perhaps we should have a law like this in place that just deals with foreign agents who are here working for companies in the United States. But that's not what we're dealing with today. What we're dealing with today is a law that also specifically deals with United States citizens. It's allowed for under the definition, and it will be a problem that we have to deal with if we accept that this is a rightful resolution. Second, I want to talk about under the limits on the government. He stated, number one, it's not all right to steal, and it's not all right to steal, so therefore we have a right to prosecute these people if they're stealing, if they're breaking a law. Now, I'd like to point out, how do we find out if somebody is committing espionage? Take terrorism, for an example. We have to go take these people's personal information, we have to find out personal information about them in order to find out what is being done. That's what differentiates it in many ways from a typical breaking of a law, such as a murder or robbery. There are other ways to find out. When it comes to espionage, you most times have to violate that person's personal rights, their rights to privacy, in order to figure out whether or not they committed the crime, and that's the problem that we're dealing with. As my partner brought up, the only instances when this should be allowed is when lives are at risk. If a life is at risk, as it is in terrorism, then it's absolutely justifiable. But lives are not at risk in this situation. There's not an immediate threat to life, and therefore we should not be allowing the government to take away our property rights without due cause. Next, I'd like to talk about under this issue of, yes.
So Caroline, I'm still not understanding how we're losing property rights by saying that even a domestic person isn't allowed to steal someone else's trade secrets and send them overseas.
Absolutely, we would agree with that, and I think that people shouldn't be stealing information. That's why we have patent laws. That's why we have contracts. That's why we have those kind of things. The problem with espionage is that it requires all of these further things to be done in order to find that out, and it opens the door for the violation of privacy. We have laws already in place that are good laws to deal with this domestically. The problem with this law is that it goes too far, and it should not be applied to domestic agents. Next, I want to talk about the argument of inconsistency. I don't think that this was fully addressed or addressed at all by side government in their speech. The problem is that we're not doing this for the protection of rights. If you look at the definition given to us by the FBI and by the Interregnum Committee, it merely states that this is only when property is stolen to be given to foreign governments. If it was about protecting people's rights, it would be any time information is stolen and given to anybody in a foreign country, but they're limiting it to governments. So it's clearly only talking about, this is clearly only being put in place because of government domination, because we want United States domination. If we were truly concerned with the issue of protecting property rights and we thought that violation was correct, this wouldn't be the policy that we would have. We would have a different policy dealing with any time an agent comes in and steals our information and gives it to anybody in a foreign country, not just a foreign government. Why are we limiting it? Why are we limiting it? Why are we limiting it? I'm sorry. We're limiting it because we're doing it for the wrong reasons. Next, I'd like to talk about a couple of the responses he gave to the points that my partner brought up against his case. Under the point that it is theft, he stated that these people are under contracts. And I got up in my POI and I asked him, does it say anywhere in the definition that these people are under contracts, that they have some kind of gag order on the information? No, it doesn't. He didn't respond to my POI. He tried to kind of skirt around it, but he didn't actually respond to the issue at hand. If these people are under contracts, if these people are under gag orders, then that's already going to be dealt with in another area of the law. The problem is that's not specified under this definition. It's not specified that these people are under any kind of contract, that they've given any kind of word that they won't give out this information. We can assume, yeah, usually the people who have the secrets are under some kind of contract, but sometimes that's not the case. Maybe they accidentally got emailed it, or maybe something happened and they just happened to go to the wrong meeting accidentally, or maybe they did it on purpose. I don't know. But either way, they didn't sign a contract saying that they wouldn't do it. So is it our right as the government to violate that? Next, I want to talk about this argument that it's immoral, and I have 2 points against this. My first point is that it is not the government's job to deal with all moral wrongs. Does the government deal with a moral wrong like adultery? No, it doesn't. The government's job is to protect people's freedom, to protect people's privacy and their lives, and we're doing the exact opposite of that with this resolution, which is why we should not side with the government. We should side with the opposition. What is the role of government? Sure, it's great when the government can uphold moral laws, and we wish everybody in the world acted perfectly, but that's not always the case. So therefore, we have to consider where the government should get involved and where they shouldn't get involved. And I think that we should draw the line at the point where privacy is being violated. At that point, the government shouldn't be involved because of the hierarchy of rights that my partner brought up that I also don't think was fully addressed in their speech. We have this hierarchy of rights given to us by Locke, who was supported as a good source by the government side. Locke states that we should have this hierarchy of rights. Life is our utmost rights. Freedom is our right after that. And then not the last right, but the next right in line is privacy. And we're taking... Sorry, not privacy. The last right is property. I'm getting those 2 words confused. They're kind of similar. Okay, so the right of property should not be the right of privacy should not be violated at the cost of the right of privacy. Okay. Take 2. We should not violate the right of privacy for the sake of the right of property. There we go. Got it out. That is the bottom line. That is the line in the sand that we have to draw as a government, is that we have to protect people's freedom and their privacy. And the only way to find out about this espionage is, typically by stealing people's not stealing their private information, but I think it's stealing their private information, by taking their private information and using that incorrectly. And that is something that we, on-site opposition, simply cannot support. Do the ends justify the means? That is what this entire round has to boil down to. Do the ends justify the means? And we, on-site opposition, absolutely do not think they do, because of the hierarchy of rights, because of the role of government, and because this problem can be dealt with in a different way, by a better definition, and by a different definition, I guess, of what espionage is. Under the definition that's being presented by side government and by the FBI, we don't believe that this resolution should be accepted. Thank you.
All right, everyone ready? In this final speech of the opposition, I have a lot of points to cover, so I'm going to move relatively quickly, but I'm going to try and address three main points, three main voting issues. And the first of those voting issues, the key points in today's round, is I'm not that great with words. Not that great with them, ironic since I do a lot of debate, but that being said, even though I'm not that great with words, I'm pretty sure I know what the definition of whoever means. And I would argue that under the definition of the FBI, when it says whoever, it means anyone. Not foreign agents specifically, not even domestic agents specifically, it literally means anyone, and that includes everyone. And this is important. This is important because the government side keeps trying to limit this round to foreign specifically and then side-skirt the issue domestically. And we really want to emphasize our problem with this side, the problem with this definition, has to do with the fact of its wording of whoever. If it didn't say whoever and to actually specify who it means, we'd probably be fine with it. But the problem is it includes both foreign and domestic. And this matters because, first of all, we want the protection of prevention of economic espionage for foreign agents. We want to prevent foreign agents from coming in, stealing our trade secrets, and using it to benefit other nations. They have different rights under the American Constitution. They do not have the same rights or are entitled to the same rights that American citizens are. So that's completely fine for them to be closely examined to ensure they are not trying to benefit their own nation. On the domestic side, we have a huge problem with the concept that we're allowed to treat our own citizens the same way we would treat immigrants or the same way we would treat people who are here on a temporary visa. We have a huge problem with that on the opposition side because it's actually just moving aside our Constitution entirely and allowing us to treat our citizens the same as we would treat people who are visiting from other countries, and that is our problem. Our other source of the problem is that under our domestic side, while we agree that stealing intellectual property is completely wrong, we already have patent laws put in place to deal with it. We already have laws put in place to deal with the protection of property. Our problem is that under this definition of whoever allows us to treat domestic people exactly how we would treat foreign people violate their individual rights, which wouldn't be the same under these patent laws. Our other problem is because theft has already been dealt with under these patent laws, what is the purpose of having this here with this specific focus on benefiting a foreign nation? And we would argue the only reason they've added this extra law, even though the property rights have already been dealt with under separate laws, is specifically so that America can compete against other foreign nations and prevent them to get the economic edge. There's no justification for it under property because those property problems have already been dealt with under other laws. It is only there so America can try and get an edge over competition. Now, even that of itself wouldn't be a problem except for the fact that it's allowing itself under the word whoever to step all over domestic and citizens' rights in its attempt to make itself stronger. And we would under that, while the Constitution does allow America to protect itself, it does not allow itself to protect itself at the cost of the rights of its own citizens. Now, moving on to the second voting issue, and probably one of the key voting issues in today's round, is government is not our mother. Again, government is not our mother. And this is kind of touched on by my partner, which is we absolutely want our government to uphold moral behavior. But at the end of the day, government's job is not to make every single moral law possible and to force us to be moral, which is kind of what the government side is arguing for. Now, it sounded very passionate, very convincing. Property stealing is absolutely wrong. We need to keep in mind that property is not the end-all, be-all, in the sense that we do not have the right to go and violate someone's right to privacy simply because of the golden angel that is property rights. We would argue government's first and foremost job is to protect this hierarchy of rights, our life first, our freedom next, and then our property, and to do so whenever possible, but not at the cost of those first two. Government is there to protect us when possible, but at the end of the day, we don't make laws for adultery just because it's immoral. We respect people's rights to freedom of choice and their right to privacy, and that is a key issue that is being discarded by the government side. Under the guise of we must stop stealing, it becomes we must stop stealing at all costs. Under the FBI definition of whoever, we are allowed to treat domestic citizens exactly the same and stop the theft at all costs, even if that cost is the right to privacy, even that cost is the right to freedom. Now, how do we know this is going to cost the right to freedom? Just a quick clarification. Since we're dealing with economic espionage, espionage has to be dealt with similar to how any espionage would be dealt with. You don't know what's taking place. Maybe you have a suspicion, but you're not certain. You certainly don't have any form of reasonable doubt. And unlike terrorism, which actually does say, hey, people are about to die, we have a right to set aside due process and go straight into people's personal records to save life. And instead, what the government side is arguing is we have the right to set aside everyone's rights simply because they might be trading secrets to foreign nations, which, technically isn't against the Constitution and probably isn't even in a contracted form under this definition, meaning under a very slim, very unreasonable, possibility they might be trading secrets to foreign nations, America is stepping in, violating its own citizens' rights just to prevent a different nation from getting the edge. And I would argue this is not justified under our Constitution, not justified under John Locke, and not justified under our founding fathers' belief about how America should behave. This leads me to my final voting issue, that of freedom at what cost. And I really want to emphasize this, particularly since the government side is about to have the last word. Ask yourself throughout their speech, at what cost? Now, tying back to my first voting issue, I'm not that great with words. I'm not that great with names either, but I know one of our founding fathers said something to the gist of this. Those who would deliver freedom for the sake of security deserve neither freedom nor security. And the principle of that is that if you are willing to surrender all your freedoms just for the minutest bit of security, the possibility that you could be more secure, you don't deserve either the freedom or the security that you're getting. And I would argue that the government side is putting so much power into the hands of government, allowing it to essentially become NSA, except legally this time, to step in only for the purpose of not even protecting your life, but for the purpose of maybe protecting a private firm's property. And while I would argue protection of property is important, it is already protected domestically under other patent laws, and on a foreign perspective, we need a different law, not this one, not as defined by the FBI. So we urge you to vote for a side that limits governments, provides the best place for which government can protect its citizens while also defending property, but not at the cost of individual rights and not the cost of our Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, House of Barton. Thank you, Dr. Thornbury, Mr. Leedy, Reverend Leedy, Dr. Leedy, whatever. Dr. Parks, the entire Interregnum committee for putting on just a great Interregnum this year. Let's give them all a big hand. Thank you, guys. So I've had a great time debating today, and I'm glad that we got up against Barton at the end because they are a sister house, and we've just had a great time debating them. But I do think that their arguments did have some flaws today, and I want to get into those. So their two main arguments are, firstly, this goes against the hierarchy of rights. You have to have higher rights protected you can't sacrifice higher rights for the sake of lower rights. And we would agree with this, but we're going to explain why their analysis didn't actually meet that burden. But then also, they said that this is going to cause massive losses in the rights. Not just are we valuing privacy, or not just are we valuing property rights over privacy, but we're going to lose all of our rights if we allow this. We're just going to create this massive government that's no longer going to respect us. We're going to get the NSA. So I'm going to address those in order, and then get into just rebuilding our case and explaining why we still think that we've given you the most definitive analysis in this round by talking about why stealing is still going to be wrong either way, even if it isn't pragmatic, as they would have you believe. But then also why this isn't going to be merciful, and there's no reason why we would want it to go on anyway. Okay, so what about the hierarchy of rights? I think it's interesting that the two sources they cite, the Constitution and John Locke, neither of them talk about a right to privacy. And we think there's a reason for that. That's because the right to privacy isn't as intrinsic to human nature as the right to property. John Locke gave us the analysis that says your right to property stems from your right to life. You have a right to live, and therefore you have a right to whatever your life gives you. You go out and you harvest some acorns. You spend some of your life grabbing the acorns. You now have a right to grind those up, turn them into bread, and eat it. It would be wrong for somebody to steal that from you. However, he doesn't talk about a right to privacy. Where did the right to privacy come from? We see that, I believe it was in the 70s, when the court cases evaluating abortion happened. They said that we think that we have a right to privacy because of emanations of penumbra, of the things that are said in the Constitution. They said it doesn't actually say it anywhere, but there's sort of general principles, and we think we can infer from that you probably have a right to be private and not have people infringe on your rights. So it's not explicit in either of the places. This isn't to say that we don't think privacy is a good thing. We do. We accept their statement that we should try to limit government as much as possible. We don't want the NSA coming in and listening to our phone calls and things like that. However, we don't think that even the right to privacy is as fundamental as the right to property. We think property probably would come before that in the hierarchy of rights. But what if it didn't? What if the order of rights went privacy, then life, then freedom, then property way down here? We would say even if that was the case, we still think we win. But before I go on, I'll take your point.
Okay, so with espionage, you don't know what's going to happen until after it happens. Same with thievery, you usually don't know what happens until after it happens. So if we're so focused on, protecting property rights, why don't we say install cameras inside our houses in order, because it would violate privacy, certainly, but it would ensure to a better protection of property. I would argue, how would you relate that similar to, violating someone's privacy just so you can find property rights? Aren't they the same thing?
Yeah, so we think there's good reasons why we don't do both of these things, and that's what I was just about to get into, where what if privacy was the highest good? We would say we wouldn't ever sacrifice privacy for the sake of protecting property, but we don't think that's necessary to this motion. We don't think you need the NSA, we don't think you need cameras in everyone's houses to combat international espionage. So what happens? They're right, it's always going to be after the fact. All of a sudden, you're going to see a flood of really cheap iPhones on the market coming in from other countries and be like, oh wow, it looks like somebody stole the plans to Apple. We should try to figure out how that happened. So they're going to go back, they're going to look through the evidence. Presumably, eventually, after finding evidence, getting probable cause, getting all the proper search warrants, and all the things, they're going to find the person who did it. What we think this motion is really dealing with is at that point, is this law a good way to deal with that? Is this law that says we're going to treat this as international espionage because they sent it overseas? Is that a good thing? We don't think that you need to install cameras. We don't think you need to infringe people's property rights to know that it's bad to steal, to know that it's bad to steal a company's information and send it overseas. We think that that's not a justified burden that they're trying to place on us. We don't have to defend the Brave New World or 1984 to say that we think that it's bad for people to steal things. Okay. So we don't think that you have to violate the right to privacy to protect the right to property. And we don't think they ever give us any reason to believe that. So that's sort of the main problem that we had with their case, is that they never really drew the link for us between how we're going to actually lose rights because of this. They said the best way to enforce this, the most effective way to enforce this would be if we all sacrificed our property rights and nobody had any more privacy. Now we would know when all the espionage was happening and we could stop it. That's not what happens in the status quo. That's not what we're defending. We don't have to defend that. So why is this motion good? We think that even if it wasn't just going to, or even if it was just going to stop foreign competition from infringing on the property rights of our businessmen, that it would still be a good thing. Why is this? Well, they talked about the role of government, and we think that's really twofold. Firstly, the role of government is to reward good and to punish evil. And they said, well, sometimes this isn't the case. We don't make laws against adultery. And we would say, well, yeah, I mean, there are some laws against adultery, like breach of marriage contracts and things like that. We think that's probably a good thing. But even if we didn't have any moral laws, we'd see that there are still good pragmatic reasons to go against this. That's what we gave you in the first speech. We would say, even if we didn't think the government was going to be moral, the government has a duty to protect the interests of its own people. We think this is a really shallow view of government, that would be its only duty. But if we accept their burden of that being the government's only duty, then it is good to protect the interests of our businessmen against the foreign interests that they're talking about. However, we don't think that's the only purpose of government. We think the government does have a role to punish good and reward evil. So why do we think that this is evil? Punish evil, reward good. Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. So we think that stealing is intrinsically evil for the examples we gave you, because of the analysis I gave you about John Locke, and because of the biblical injunctions against theft and taking the fruits of other people's labor. We think that that stealing is intrinsically wrong. So what about the case they're telling us? They're saying, well, maybe this is just a really good-natured person who works for a company. They haven't signed any contract. They just sort of accidentally found out this information. They knew it was coming from the company and it was secret, but they were like, actually, I think this would be really, really good. The people in India might need this. It would help them out a lot, so I'm going to send it over there. We would say even that person, even that domestic person, ought to be punished. And why is it different from simple patent law? We think patent law usually deals with cases in which a person is taking something to enrich themselves. We think that when you're sending it overseas to somebody who's going to have the increased competition and who will be able to produce the product outside of our jurisdiction. So if it goes to China or something, they can produce it in factories cheaper than we can. That's a fundamentally different crime. That's not just taking it to benefit yourself. That's taking it to create all of this competition for other people. So we think that the real key here is that it's not going to be practical in the long term. It's going to take away the incentive to keep on producing these things that are good for humanity. But also, it's just intrinsically immoral. And for those reasons, we're happy to support it. Thank you.